Have you ever glanced at your neighbor's house and wondered what secrets lie behind their closed doors? In tonight's journey, we're peeling back the curtains of the ordinary to reveal 4 spine-chilling tales about neighbors who are anything but what they seem. From the unsettling to the unexplainable, these stories will make you question how well you truly know the people living just a wall away. So lock your doors and get ready to dive into the hidden depths of the seemingly mundane, because what we're about to uncover is anything but ordinary. In the heart of a quaint suburban neighborhood, where each house boasted manicured lawns and friendly faces, I found my new home. The community welcomed me with open arms, and among these friendly faces was Mr. Thompson, my next-door neighbor. With his warm smile and gentle demeanor, he seemed like the epitome of the perfect neighbor. Our encounters were often brief but pleasant. Mr. Thompson, a widower in his late 60s, lived alone. His children long moved out. He had a knack for gardening, and his yard was a testament to his passion. But it was during one of our casual conversations over the fence that I first felt a twinge of unease. He knew a little too much about everyone in the neighborhood, their routines, their vacations, even their recent purchases. I brushed it off as small-town gossip, typical of close-knit communities. However, my curiosity piqued when I noticed something odd during one of these chats. Mr. Thompson was wearing a watch strikingly similar to one I'd seen on Mr. Daniels, another neighbor, flaunting just a week ago. A coincidence, I thought, but something in the back of my mind whispered otherwise. As days turned into weeks, I began to notice more peculiarities. Mrs. Lewis was really sad about losing her scarf. The Hendersons had reported their antique vase as being missing, and many children reported they lost their toys. Did a burglar break into multiple homes in this neighborhood on the same night or something? I didn't lose anything, but it felt strange. One day, Mr. Thompson, having sprained his ankle, needed help organizing some heavy boxes in his garage. He seemed hesitant but had no choice. He couldn't manage it alone. As a good neighbor, I offered to assist. The garage was cluttered, a stark contrast to the meticulous care he took of his home and yard. Among the mess, I noticed a box partially hidden under a tarp. Something about its secretive placement piqued my curiosity, while Mr. Thompson rested his ankle and directed me on where to move other items. I found a moment to discreetly peek inside the concealed box. That's when I discovered the trove of stolen items, leading to the revelation of Mr. Thompson's unsettling secret and the subsequent involvement of the police. Shock rooted me to the spot as I stared at the box's contents. The Hendersons' antique vase, valuable jewelry, and even children's toys. Treasures thoughtlessly taken and hoarded in secrecy. My mind raced and my heart was pounding, but I knew I had to remain composed. Mr. Thompson was still in the garage, unaware of my discovery. "Everything all right over there?" Mr. Thompson called out, his voice tinged with a hint of apprehension. "Yes, just rearranging these boxes," I replied, my voice steady despite the loud pounding of my heart. I finished up the task as quickly as I could without arousing suspicion. Mr. Thompson thanked me, his usual friendly demeanor now sending shivers down my spine. I left his house with a polite goodbye, my mind racing with every step. Once safely inside my own home, I locked the door and immediately called the police. My voice was a mix of anger and disbelief as I recounted my findings. The police arrived swiftly. Their arrival met with Mr. Thompson's confused protests, but as they unearthed the cache of stolen items from his garage, his facade crumbled, revealing the truth of his deceitful obsession. The neighborhood was abuzz as police cars lined our street. Neighbors gathered, their expressions a mix of curiosity and concern. When the stolen items were brought out, the air was filled with gasps and murmurs. People recognized their lost possessions. A brooch here, a set of keys there. Each item, a story of loss and now, unexpected recovery. Mr. Thompson was taken away in handcuffs, his head bowed in shame. The friendly neighbor, the man we all thought we knew, was a stranger hiding a disturbing secret. As the reality of his actions set in, the neighborhood was left reeling. Trust, once freely given, was now fractured. In the days that followed, the police returned the stolen items to their rightful owners. There were tearful reunions with possessions that held sentimental value, and each return was a small step towards healing the community's wounded trust. But for me, the incident left a lasting impact. The friendly waves and casual chats in the neighborhood now carried an undercurrent of wariness. The experience was a stark reminder that sometimes the most ordinary facade could conceal the most extraordinary secrets. And in a world where appearances could be so deceiving, the true nature of those around us might remain an unsettling mystery. When Anna and I moved into our first house together, the excitement was palpable. It was a charming old neighborhood with a mix of young families and longtime residents. Everyone seemed welcoming, except for the house next door. It stood out with its perpetually drawn curtains and an air of neglect that seemed out of place. Our curiosity about the mysterious neighbor was initially just a passing thought, overshadowed by the thrill of setting up our new home. We hardly ever saw anyone come in or out of that house. "Maybe he's just a recluse," Anna would say, trying to dismiss the unease that the house seemed to emanate. As the days grew shorter and the nights longer, we began to notice odd shadows moving behind the curtains of the neighboring house. Sometimes, late at night, we'd hear soft, eerie noises, like whispers carried by the wind. Our initial curiosity turned into a mild obsession. We'd find ourselves staring at the house, trying to make sense of the shadows. One chilly evening, as we were about to close our blinds, we saw it clearly, the distinct silhouette of a person behind the sheer curtain, followed by a blood-curdling scream that pierced the quiet night. Our hearts stopped. We looked at each other, eyes wide with fear. "Was that what I think it was?" Anna whispered, her voice trembling. We debated calling the police, but decided to investigate ourselves first. Armed with nothing but a flashlight, we cautiously approached the neighbor's house. The front door was slightly ajar, which only added to our apprehension. Pushing it open, we stepped into a world that seemed frozen in time. Dust particles danced in the beam of our flashlight, and the air was thick with silence. As we moved through the house, the source of the shadows became apparent. The living room was like an artist's studio, filled with sculptures and installations. A projector was casting images onto the curtains, creating the illusion of movement. It was both fascinating and unsettling in its eccentricity. Our relief was palpable, but it was short-lived. We heard a noise behind us and turned to see an elderly man standing in the doorway. His eyes were as haunting as the art that filled the room. "I see you found my gallery," he said, his voice as soft as the shadows he created. He introduced himself as Mr. Clayton, an artist who had lived there for decades, creating art that played with light and shadow. His reclusiveness was not out of malice, but a deep immersion in his work. The scream, he explained, was a sound effect from one of his installations, meant to evoke emotion. He showed us around his house and explained each art, sculpture, and installation in detail. He explained how he made everything and how the lights and illusions of movement were made. He was an eccentric, but he was a kind, welcoming man. We left Mr. Clayton's house with mixed feelings. The mystery of the shadow behind the curtain was solved, but the encounter left us feeling unsettled. While we were creeped out by what we had seen and were not personally fans of that style, we came to accept and respect him as an artist and for his creativity. In the following weeks, I watched as Mr. Clayton's nocturnal activities continued. He opened up to us, and we learned more about his life, his art, and his taste for the small and strange things in life. The community, once wary of him as a grumpy old man and eccentric, began to view him with more compassionate eyes. Some even expressed an interest in his art, offering a kind of acceptance he hadn't felt in years. Moving into the new neighborhood, Emily and I were immediately taken in by the warmth and charm it exuded. But it was our next-door neighbor, Mrs. Winters, who truly embodied the spirit of the community. With her kind gestures and ever-present smile, she seemed like the perfect neighbor. In the beginning, Mrs. Winters was a godsend. She'd bring over freshly baked cookies, offer to water our plants when we were away, and was always there with a helping hand. Her involvement in our daily lives felt like a blessing, a stroke of luck to have such a caring neighbor. However, as weeks turned into months, her kindness began to take a more invasive turn. What started as friendly check-ins became unannounced visits. Our conversations, once casual and light, were now filled with probing questions about our personal lives. Mrs. Winters seemed increasingly fixated on us, particularly on Emily. The situation reached a tipping point during one of her unexpected visits. Mrs. Winters, with a manic glint in her eye, began speaking about how she had started to see us as the children she never had. She talked of a future where we would be one big happy family. The intensity in her voice sent a cold shiver down our spines. It became clear that Mrs. Winters was not just a friendly neighbor. She was someone struggling with profound loneliness and delusional attachment. Fearing for our privacy and safety, we knew we had to act. We decided to approach the situation with empathy and caution. Instead of confronting her or involving the police, we reached out to a social worker who specialized in mental health. With their guidance, we sat down with Mrs. Winters to express our concerns and suggest she seek help. The conversation was heart-wrenching. Tears streamed down Mrs. Winters' face as she opened up about her loneliness and the fantasies she had built around us. It was a moment of painful honesty and vulnerability. With the social worker's help, Mrs. Winters agreed to start therapy. She was diagnosed with a condition that caused her to form unhealthy attachments, explaining her behavior towards us. In the weeks that followed, Mrs. Winters kept her distance, focusing on her therapy and recovery. The neighborhood, once buzzing with gossip about her, slowly returned to its peaceful rhythm. Emily and I, while relieved, couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness for the lonely woman who had, in her own misguided way, just sought connection. In our hearts, we hoped that Mrs. Winters would find the peace and companionship she so deeply craved, in a way that was healthy and fulfilling. Our perfect neighbor wasn't so perfect after all, but then again, maybe none of us are.